When we first met the guy, we couldn't quite understand why Guts hated him so much or why he became a demonic angel, but as the series unfolded, we saw quite clearly why Griffith becomes what he becomes. The White Falcon feels enigmatic to most people because he wants things to be that way. Deep inside, he's a man that's willing to do anything to get what he wants, and when that thing is world domination, the limitations on what a person will do to gain power go straight into the abyss. Griffith has done some terrible things across his lifetimes, but these 10 things that he did to his closest friends are the worst. Let's take a look. Griffith doesn't think of his friends as being his friends. In order to understand the contents of this list, we need to talk about friendship first. More specifically, Griffith's definition of friendship. Because for most of us, a friend is someone we can call up in a time of need, be that emotional, material, or purely for the sake of it. It's a mutual dynamic where affection and care for each other is the primary defining aspect. Yes, friends fight, and there are some friends you trust more than others, but you get what we're trying to convey here. And for a long time, many Falcons thought that Griffith wasn't just their leader, he was also their friend. One of the most prominent moments of this would be when Griffith sent a rescue party out for Guts and Casa, despite his new noble allies urging him not to. He told them that the pair was integral to the foundation of the Band of the Falcon. When Casca heard it, she was overjoyed. Most Falcons cheered on this act of seeming friendship, but the truth is, Griffith was simply preserving his most valuable chess pieces. There's a point in the story where the White Falcon is having a conversation with Princess Charlotte, and he reveals his true thoughts on what a friend is, and none of his soldiers fit the profile. To Griffith, a friend is someone that can be his equal. That means it's a person who has their own dream, and they would do anything in their power to make it reality. To him, a friend is someone who will scratch, claw, and kill their way to achieving their dreams, and thereby stand beside him as an equal. He values his soldiers' companionship and camaraderie, but he has never allowed the distinction between soldier and friend to get blurred in his mind. Guts is his raider captain and Casca his second in command. They're his top 2 fighters and military leaders. Losing them would mean a premature death for Griffith's dream, so he made the move he deemed necessary to preserve it. It's sad because if he had actually paid attention to his men's lives, he'd know that there were many just like him amongst them. Gaston's ambition might have been smaller than Griffith's, but he wanted to open a tailor shop in Midland once he had saved enough money and had enough adventures. Corcus might have been a stuck-up snob, but he wanted to live the high life as a knight, and Griffith helped him achieve that dream, oblivious as he might have been to it. Judo and Pippin had been with him since the beginning, over half a decade easily, and yet they don't qualify as friends. The fact that he sees everyone as tools for a task recontextualizes so many of his actions that it's not even funny. It's because Guts overheard Griffith's definition of a friend that he eventually decides to leave the Falcons. This entry is the gateway to most of the other disturbing things Griffith does to his friends throughout the rest of the series. He hid his assassination and kidnapping plot from most of his captains. As mercenaries, the band didn't ask Griffith too many questions about working with a guy like Gennon. Maybe it was because they knew better, or maybe it was because they didn't know. Either way, as long as most of their time was spent winning battles, they were gonna be fine. But then Griffith became a Viscount, and now suddenly, everything the band did had political implications. Their undefeated record put a massive target on Griffith's back, and there was an attempt on his life not once, but twice. He had pretty much sniffed out his enemies after the first one, and put plans and emotions so that he could be in control of the second. But because this was going to be an extremely long game, Griffith needed to keep his knowledge a close-guarded secret, so he involved only Guts in his decision to assassinate Count Julius, the man who wanted him dead. He also enlisted the Black Swordsman for the kidnapping of Minister Foss's daughter, so Griffith could deal with the rest of his enemies with one blazing inferno. To make the second plan work, he also faked his own death, but because no one else knew about his plans, they all thought he actually died. From a tactical perspective, this was a masterstroke because Griffith managed to weed out all of his opposition with 2 precise operations. But on a humanistic level, it's horrifying that he let his comrades deal with the consequences of his ambition. Guts kills Julius, but ends up killing his son Adonis as well, and this accidental killing of a child leaves him traumatized. He looks for Griffith immediately afterwards so he can get some sort of resolution, but instead ends up deciding to leave the Falcons after realizing his place in Griffith's heart. Griffith faking his death was still real to his comrades, and they were openly panicking and mourning him. Casca had pretty much accepted it until the moment he revealed himself. He constantly constantly plays with his comrades' emotions because he doesn't trust them to understand his methods. And as for the consequences, Griffith has no remorse for his actions. When he learns that Julius and Adonis died, he smiles a wicked smile because his path to marrying Charlotte just blew wide open. He also has the same look after burning the queen and her co-conspirators because he knows everything is going according to his plan. Even Judo admits that Griffith doesn't show his dark side to all of them because he doesn't think they can take it, but he shows it to Guts because he clearly can. Even though Griffith denies it, he trusts Guts like a friend, which is bloody ironic as you'll see in just a few moments. He constantly put the band in positions where they had to rely on him for survival. One of the things that attracted many young men to Griffith's banners was his legendary undefeated streak. The Band of the Falcon was notorious for being absolutely lethal in battle. Even Guts was aware of their reputation as the Grim Reapers of the field before he made their acquaintance, and this was down to Griffith's ingenious war strategies. The Falcon would always take everything into account when going into a battle and plan things down to the last detail. Things would often play out just how he wanted them to, as if he was writing the story by hand. But this also means that he constantly risked their lives for his ambition, and he didn't even have the courtesy to feel remorse over their deaths. Griffith once told Casa that all he could do to repay his comrades' deaths was to keep winning, and to that end, he puts the band through situations other armies would have refused getting into given how insane they were. The first major gamble Griffith made with his men's lives was enlisting them to work for Genin. He knew the governor's reputation but needed his money to make his own ambitions grow quicker, so he exploited the man and somehow managed to keep it quiet that the Band of the Falcon had ever fought for him. Had this fact came out before he enlisted them with the Kingdom of Midland, Griffith would have never become Viscount in the first place. In fact, he and his men might have been hunted down as secret Tudor loyalists because Genin was a Tudor nobleman, or maybe they'd be hunted down for serving a pedophile, considering how serious the Holy See takes that kind of stuff. His second major gamble also served as his reunion with Genin because it was the battle for Doldry Castle, a fortress governed by the perverse governor. The 1997 anime makes Griffith's victory seem more clever in comparison to the manga because there you can feel the desperate situation he puts his men into. Griffith divides the band into two and sends one unit, led by the still recovering Casca, to capture the fortress. The rest he puts between a river and Genin's massive Purple Rhino Knights unit, with the order to fight until their death. The tide of the battle was in Tudor's favor for the majority of the battle, and the Tudor general Boscoin nearly had Guts beat until Zod intervened. It was causality's will that Griffith win that particular battle, and the Battle of Doldry was truly won by a twist of fate. Had Zod not shown up, Griffith's strategy would have failed, and Boscoin would have snapped Guts' sword in half. Griffith himself was no longer the warrior he used to be when he first fought Guts. He'd have risked it all and lost if he weren't chosen, but the only reason his men fought as fervently as they did was because they thought he would lead them into a golden age. But speaking of losing, he treats Guts like his property, not a human being. This kind of ties into our first point about Griffith thinking of his soldiers as more tools than men, but it all becomes glaringly obvious when he loses Guts. The first time Griffith met Guts was as an adversary, but he wanted to make him an ally. He couldn't deny Guts' obvious talent as a swordsman and his usefulness as a one-man war machine, so he proposed that Guts join his party, and when he was refused, the pair fought a duel to decide the former's fate. When Griffith won that duel, he declared that Guts now belonged to Griffith. Well, it felt like writer's fancy at first. When Griffith continued to use property-based nomenclature to address his relationship with Guts, it became clear that Griffith saw Guts as an object, not as a person. During his first mission as a Falcon, Guts was assigned rear guard duty and he almost died until Griffith intervened. It was the first time the Falcon put his life on the line for another soldier's, and most of his men were shocked by Griffith's demeanor up until he rescued Guts because they'd never seen him so frazzled. Guts himself had picked up on the fact that he was getting some sort of special treatment, considering Casca had berated him a few nights back and everyone kept looking at him weird. He asked Griffith why he did what he did, and the answer sort of betrays the dynamic that the pair ends up cultivating. Griffith tells him it was simply because he didn't want to lose an excellent soldier like Guts shortly after acquiring him. This makes sense to an extent, considering Guts pushed his best fights to the limit and even killed one of them. But there are other moments from the series that make it plain as day that Griffith subconsciously thinks of Guts as a friend. Part 6 of the Guardian Angels of Desire prelude chapters opens with a scene where Griffith pulls Guts out of a mound of enemy corpses. He marvels at the swordsman's devil's luck and then goes on to openly muse about his own ambitions. Griffith tells Guts his innermost thoughts with no hesitation, something that shocks him as well considering he's usually such a closed-off person. He involves Guts in his worst schemes, and then asks him whether he thinks Griffith is evil for doing these things because Guts' approval matters to him. We know it's because he feels a sort of kinship with Guts that he doesn't feel with the rest of his soldiers. He would never ask that sort of question to any of the other Falcons. But Griffith is blind to the same, and this leads him to act like a maniacal slave owner towards the end of his association with Guts. The only way people left Griffith's employment was either through death or excommunication. No one willingly departed the band of the Falcon, partly because those who lived through their battles knew they were better off staying alive and beside Griffith. The White Falcon was undefeated, and it was a ticket to glory for any man brave enough to fight underneath his banner. Those foolish enough to cross him, spy on him, or be incompetent in his presence were dealt with appropriately. No one had expressed a desire to leave Griffith's grasp in his entire life until Guts did it. When that happened, Griffith spiraled hard. His opening approach to that conversation in the snow was pointed and stoic. He realized Guts was firmly resolved to leave the Falcons, so he invoked the mercenary's way and demanded that he win his freedom the same way he lost it. Griffith challenged Guts to a duel, and he was so serious that he shooed Casa away. Judo could sense his lack of composure by looking at his face, but he didn't know the half of it. Inside, Griffith was panicking like a baby that was about to see its favorite toy crushed underneath a truck. He couldn't comprehend how someone that belonged to him would want to leave his grasp so desperately, so he made up his mind that he would kill Guts if he had to. We see his thoughts play out in rapid succession, where he plans each step and decides that he would be okay with that outcome as long as it meant he still owned the man's loyalty. Griffith acknowledges the risk of taking Guts head on after his 3-year growth, but goes for it anyway, and is shocked when he loses. All the while, Casca and Rickert simply cannot understand why things needed to be settled this way, so Griffith's fragility ends up disturbing his other friends as well. Even the departing Guts had to speak words of affirmation to his leader within his own mind, thinking to himself that Griffith was strong enough to get over this little rock in the path. Alas, that turns out to not be the case, and it endangered the lives of everyone Guts held near and dear. Griffith sleeps with Charlotte and endangers the entire band's lives. From the moment Griffith met Charlotte in Chapter 7, we knew he was going to put the moves on her. He had to. If he wanted to become king, Griffith was going to have to take the marital route. He had no ties to any royal family through blood, so staging a rebellion would not be in his favor. Even if he managed to take over a kingdom, he wouldn't have the legitimacy to rule over it, and would be destroyed by neighboring powers instead. If he wanted his kingship to have proper authority, he needed to enter the ranks of a proper royal family through a formal ceremony. That can only happen through marriage, and so there's a distinct possibility that Griffith chose to align with Midland during the Hundreds-Year War because he knew its only legitimate heir was a woman. In Charlotte's presence, he does everything right. He's courteous, playful, mysterious, and brave, all things that sheltered princesses like her would easily fall for. The first time they got to spend some proper time together, Griffith showed Charlotte how to make a flute out of a leaf and even took a crossbow bolt for her, though we know it was meant for Griffith in reality. The second time they spoke, he gave her his ambitious "I have a dream" speech, and that pretty much sealed the deal. The next morning, Charlotte gives Griffith the male half of a couple lodestones so that he can return safely to her from the battle for Doldry. The lodestone is also a symbol of love, so clearly the princess is in Griffith's bag. But while Charlotte's emotions are pure, Griffith's are all calculated. In fact, he does some of the most heinous things to ensure events play out exactly how he wants them to. He had Guts kill Julius, but Adonis's death was his true reward, as the young man would have been betrothed to Charlotte soon, in accordance with Midland's custom. Now that he was out of the picture, Griffith was open to pursue her to his heart's content, which made him break into an evil grin that has since become his trademark. The entire band knew that if Griffith wanted to become king, he needed to marry a queen, including Casca. No one had an issue with it because they believed in him as a leader. How betrayed they must have felt when Griffith risked all their lives for just an evening of pleasure. After Guts' departure, Griffith seduces Princess Charlotte and sleeps with her. To her, it's the culmination of a fairy tale romance, but to him, it's a way to regain control over his own life after losing his best soldier in Guts. Griffith must have known how risky it was to sneak into the Midland Royal Palace to do this, but he was too far gone to care. That's why when he was discovered the next morning, he didn't exactly resist arrest, and he didn't exactly care that his actions had just given all his men a permanent death sentence within the kingdom. Casca, Pippin, Judo, and the rest of the Falcons found out they'd been marked for death at the last possible moment. They'd been lured into open ground by the king's forces without arms or armor, under the pretext of military drills. That's when the arrows began to rain in their direction. Casca somehow managed to take control and leave the city with whatever Falcons were willing to follow her, and Griffith only made her life worse by further antagonizing the King of Midland during his imprisonment. The Falcons were deemed outlaw bandits and became #1 priority on every bordering kingdom's hit list. Griffith forced his friends to fend for their lives for over a year, all because he couldn't handle rejection. And believe it or not, that isn't even the worst thing he's done to these guys. Griffith sacrificed his friends to become a demonic angel, and he has no regrets. When a man that has tasted power becomes powerless, he has one of two options. He can either accept it or scratch and claw his way back to a position where he never becomes powerless again. While the former thought did flash across Griffith's mind momentarily following his imprisonment, the latter clearly won out considering where he is today. And getting to that point involved the most despicable thing he's ever done to the people he fought alongside for a major chunk of his life. Griffith sacrificed them. After being tortured and mangled in every way imaginable for more than 365 days, Griffith had had enough of friendships. He acknowledged to himself that his friend Guts was one of the only reasons he was still conscious, but he wanted to kill him because he made Griffith waver from his path. The Falcon always finds a way to rationalize his irrational thought processes, but the one thing we can't fight him on is the fact that he was truly helpless after that year of torture. He'd had his tongue removed, the tendons at his wrists and feet were both cut so he couldn't move any longer. Griffith had fully become an invalid, and he hated it, especially when he could see just how powerful Guts had become. He must have had some hope of overseeing the Falcons with his most trusted captains by his side, willing to preserve his secret, but those hopes were dashed when Wild exposed his body for the entire band to see. When that happened, Griffith lost all hope of ever fulfilling his dream, until he recalled Zod's words. He chased after an apparition of his younger self and ended up at the site of the eclipse, which he triggered by being reunited with his lost Behelit. When the God Hand explained their offer to him, he hesitated at first, but then Ubik made him acknowledge that killing was in his nature and that he'd stepped over thousands of dead bodies to get this far. So what were a few more in comparison? Griffith sacrificed all of the remaining members of the Band of the Falcon, including Pippin, Judo, and Quarkus, who had been with him since before Casca joined. None of them could believe what their leader had just done, so they convinced themselves that it was some sort of nightmare. Only Judo, Pippin, and Casca could keep their wits about themselves, and that too just barely. What makes this act even more revolting is the fact that after doing so, Griffith felt absolutely nothing. When he was sinking into the abyss following the sacrifice, the deaths of his comrades pierced through his soul, and he felt no emotions. He once went to see Guts and Rickert following his rebirth to see if he would feel something, and just as he had been promised, he felt nothing. The fact that most of those men still believed in him right up until they were mercilessly devoured by apostles is what makes this a truly disturbing moment in the story, just like the next one. Griffith violated Casca out of pure malice. Anyone who's ever even remotely heard of Berserk probably knows about this moment, so we aren't going to spend too much time rehashing the details. We'll instead be focusing on the reasons and the consequences it had for the people involved. Even before he became a God Hand member, Griffith had tried assaulting Casca. Powerlessness manifests itself in many vicious ways, and sexual dominance is something we've seen Griffith use to make himself feel better when he's at his lowest. The difference here is, with Charlotte, he knew things would work, but with Casca, he misjudged things wildly. Griffith first became acquainted with Casca when he saved her life from a lecherous nobleman. Since that day, she's been devoted to him, and he's been aware of that fact. Griffith never tried to indulge Casca's obsession with him because he had other plans for his love life, but now that he was basically a cripple, he needed to regain that sense of power he had lost over her. Shortly before he darted for the eclipse site, Griffith tried to force himself onto Casca, but his attempt was so pathetic that she hugged him out of pity. Griffith then realized that Guts and Casca had become lovers, and so when he gained the power to get revenge on the man he blamed for everything wrong with his own life, he wanted to make sure he gave him something to remember for the rest of his life. Griffith violating Casca wasn't about pleasure at all, no matter what you might see on some Reddit forum. It was all about establishing his superiority over Guts as a divine being, and he also gave Casca a harsh lesson in crossing him by becoming the reason she goes insane. The whole time he was doing it, he maintained eye contact with Guts whilst having his apostles hold him down, and when he was done, he tossed Casca aside like a used rag. He broke her mind, drove Guts to a path of vengeance, and tainted their unborn child, all in a bid to prove that he now controlled their destinies, not the other way around. What kind of sick lunatic does that to people he's been close to for years? Clearly, the man named Griffith. He once told Guts that he would decide the day the swordsman died, and now that their lives are intertwined thanks to the latter's revenge quest, that might just become reality. Griffith can manipulate the concept of space and the damn wind at this point. There's nothing he can't do. But speaking of manipulation, he has been manipulating humans and apostles alike ever since his incarnation. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, and Berserk shows us the worst examples of this phrase in action with the Revelations chapter. Now, we as readers know that by the time chapter 126 came out, Griffith had already spent 2 years as a God Hand member. He'd committed more evil acts in the past 3 years than his entire life combined. But the common folk knew nothing about this. To them, he was still Midland's savior, the hero of the 100-Year War. So, when it came time for Griffith to incarnate himself into the physical world as a God Hand member, he used the context of his last human life to control the narrative of his new one. Revelations part 1 through 3 establishes his identity as the prophetic savior of mankind known as the Falcon of Light. Those who cling to God in a desperate bid to ignore their own role in their suffering get a dream of a shining falcon, leading them to salvation. And because most people associate the Falcon with Griffith, he automatically becomes humanity's savior in their minds. When he returns and starts to liberate Midland territories from Kushan occupation, this idea further takes root in people's hearts because he was doing what none of them had been able to do. His powers and presence seemed otherworldly to mortals, which is why they accepted the Pope's designation of Griffith as the prophesied savior of the Holy See religion. And as for the apostles, they knew better than to open their mouths in front of humans that didn't. By carefully manipulating his public image as Berserk Jesus and getting humans to cooperate in military operations with apostles, Griffith slowly lays the foundation for a kingdom where all lived according to his will. And by the time he caused the Great Roar, he had pretty much achieved that task. When he wanted to hold back Ganishka's pseudo-apostles, he commanded his war demons to take their true forms in front of their human counterparts for the first time. This sent a shockwave of doubt through their ranks, but they were galvanized by a speech from Griffith's medium Sonia, who he knew was madly in love with him. The Falcon managed to get 2 natural enemies, humans and apostles, to work alongside each other, which was an incredible accomplishment. And when Falconia was established, he created a utopia, according to his general locus. But this is a false dream that is only held together thanks to Griffith's presence. In truth, his apostles lust for human blood, and he's only been able to hold them back by giving them sport in the form of other magical beasts in Pandemonium. The humans are a lot easier to deal with considering they pretty much think he's a god, but there are some within his court, like Sir Owen, who are just inching closer to the truth of his nature with every passing encounter. And then we also have to consider the fact that Griffith is just straight up lying to everyone by claiming he's a human when in truth he's a demon, and he's likely penning up people within Falconia for some sort of infernal ceremony. The moment Griffith stays away from his apostles for too long is the moment they attack his human subjects, and then what happens to his new friends? Griffith is already heartless to begin with. His sole focus in life is to establish his kingdom and take over the world and everything beyond it. To that end, he'll let humans fight alongside monsters that want to eat them at all times, and even lie to them about the salvation they think they're getting, because most people think Griffith is sending his deceased soldiers' souls to heaven when it's actually the exact opposite. He is sending the souls of those who die for him to the abyss. One of the biggest reasons that people just accepted Griffith as Berserk Jesus was the fact that he was communing with dead souls in front of their eyes. That's right, after every battle, Griffith would put on a light show for his followers, whereby he would extract the souls of his fallen soldiers and allow them to have one last conversation with their loved ones. On paper, this sounds like a beautiful thing, right? It's closure most people hope for but can never get. And the fact that Griffith actually pulls their souls out of their bodies to give people that closure certainly seems to make him divine, but in truth, it's all a lie, because he isn't sending those souls to heaven, he's sending them to hell. In the very first arc of Berserk, we learn that the fate of anyone that gets entangled with demon kind is to end up in the abyss. This is true for those marked with the brand of sacrifice and apostles as well. Everyone that gets entangled in the God Hand's plans eventually finds themselves in the vortex of souls, so there's no good reason for anyone that knows even half of this stuff to feel the way Griffith's followers feel when he liberates a soul. They're going down to the abyss to become fuel for the God Hand's powers, and Griffith pretty much admits that by chapter 195. When Mule Wolfflame asks him where the cluster of souls goes to after being separated from the body, Griffith replies by saying, to a place where they become one. Mule asks whether that place is heaven, but before he can ask about it being hell, Griffith cuts him off by saying he'll find out when his time comes, for every person's time comes eventually. After this, Mule instinctively bows down to Griffith in reverence and offers up his sword to him in fealty, as if compelled by some otherworldly force, thinking that it was destiny instead. If only he'd known how right he was to be suspicious of that cluster of souls and his unnatural urge to follow Griffith. Most people in his service are charmed into it by his mere presence as a god hand, and when he says they go to a place where they become one, he clearly means the abyss. Each time we've seen the vortex of souls, it's been represented as a spiral of endless tortured souls which contain faces that people might have seen in their pasts. When Slugcount died, his physician Vargas, who had cursed him before death and taken part in his heresy in life, was one of the damned souls that pulled him into the abyss. And Griffith is using this as the basis of him becoming the new figurehead of the Holy See religion. We're afraid that when that day comes for Mule Wolfflame, he's not going to like the answer, because it'll prove his initial skepticism of this utter stranger to have been the correct instinct. Griffith is pretty much using everyone in his new life, including Charlotte and Sonia, and it can only end in tragedy for them because he doesn't feel a shred of human emotion anymore. All he cares about is making his dream a reality, and all he cares about is winning. There is one way in which he can be defeated, but he's covered those tracks as well recently with his latest atrocity against someone he called friend. He kidnapped a heavily traumatized Casca just to cover his own weakness. If causality is his mistress, then karma is the X that will become his downfall, because Griffith violating Casca had consequences for him as well. When he infected her womb with his demonic seed, he ended up turning the fetus within it into a human-demon hybrid. This demon child has all the powers of a demon, but can likely be killed using human weapons. During Griffith's incarnation ceremony to re-enter the human world, his vessel ended up consuming this child out of pity, as it was dying when it met him. This tainted Griffith's own rebirth, because now his body was shared by another being, which had strong feelings towards its parents. Every night of a full moon, Griffith transforms into the Moonlight Boy and goes to see Casca because, in this state, his body is under the control of the demon child, who always seeks out its mother for her warmth. But a god hand who is aiming to fulfill an ancient prophecy with a body of flesh and divine powers can't afford things like mortal feelings getting in the way of his plans. And moreover, if someone were to figure out that he was vulnerable when he turned into the Moonlight Boy, all they'd have to do was kill him when he was with Casca. This is the one weakness that Griffith has no control over, because as much as he can control the weather, he can't control heavenly bodies. And full moon nights boost the powers of his demons and mages as well, so going Dragon Ball and destroying the moon wasn't exactly in the cards. The best option he had was to kidnap Casca to ensure he never left his palace when he transformed. So that's exactly what he did. When he brought her back, Griffith put her in a trance that made her forget about her real life until she came across water. When she recalled her real life, she tried to break out of Falconia and return to Guts, only to be subdued by the guards. The women attending to her were clearly spying on her to ensure the trance held, but when it didn't, they raised the alarm. Casca was put back under, and apparently Irvine saw to this. The branded girl had already endured enough trauma at Griffith's hands, so to become a pawn in his political games once again couldn't have been thrilling. She passed out at the sight of him when he showed up at Elfhelm, and she's been kept brainwashed ever since. Griffith's had his people working overtime on keeping her tranquil, and him bringing her to Falconia shows he's confident and willing to risk it all just to keep himself safe. If Casca were to convince anyone of the true nature of Griffith, there would be a rebellion within Falconia, but he can't have that, so he's torturing her again just to cover this small chink in his armor. Marvelous verdict! And with that, we've come to the end of our very disturbing list of every horrible thing Griffith has ever done to his friends. Let us know down in the comments box if you think we missed anything, or which of these was the hardest for you to handle. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.